How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 46, Daf Mem Vav, Daf 46 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, okay, firstly we have a lot to do on Daf Mem Hey Umid Beis, so we're going to start there. We're continuing, essentially going through the Mishnah that we learned on Daf Mem Beis, Elu Treifis, and we listed 18 Treifis, and we're just kind of going one by one. We have already talked about the trachea. We talked about, yesterday we talked about the brains. Today we are going to talk about the heart. Today we're going to talk about the spinal cord. Today we're going to talk about the liver. And today we are going to begin talking about the lungs. So that's what we essentially have on our plate for today. We're just going to go through it. This isn't like hard stuff per se. It's mostly, a lot of it's just kind of figuring out like, what exactly is it talking about? Like visualizing like, okay, like, yeah, like how is this connected to that? Where does this fit in? How does this, what it's describing, make sense? So, I have slides that'll help us along when necessary. And anyways, so yeah, I hope we should enjoy ourselves and have a great time learning Daf Mem Vav of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Mem Hey Amud Beis 2, 4, 5 lines into the Amud. So we really have, and it's not a small Amud, so we really do have some work to do on Daf Mem Hey Amud Beis, but I do hope that it'll kind of relatively move. I guess we will find out. Yesterday kind of relatively moved. Anyways, Nikev Alev Lebeis Chalalu, the Mishnah had said that if the heart is punctured into its space, right? Because of course the heart has 4, right, 2 ventricles, 2 atrias, whatever, I'll just say atriums. But anyways, we're about to see something pretty interesting in terms of those 2 ventricles, 2 atriums. Let's see. Reb Zera asks, Lebeis chalol ka'in or lebeis chalol gadol. You hear this? This is really interesting. You see, the Gemara is labeling the, I don't know how to like refer to the cavities, let's say. The Gemara is referring to the cavities in the heart as the big cavity and the small cavities, which is interesting. We've kind of standardized a way to talk about the heart and think about the heart as having these 4 cavities, the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, the left ventricle. But I mean, if you go back 1500 years before, maybe there was like a standardized way of talking about the heart, or maybe they had a standardized way of talking about the heart, and it was the following, that, I mean, it's interesting, if you didn't know anything about biology, I'm not claiming to know much about biology, and I just gave you a heart, and I was like, okay, tell me about it, you'd open it up, cut it in half, you'd say, well, I see that there's this one really big cavity, and that's the left ventricle, right? If you Google, is one of the cavities in the heart larger than all the rest? The left ventricle is the biggest of all the cavities, and it's also got the thickest muscle wall, because that's from the left ventricle, the blood is pumped out to the rest of the body. So it's interesting, if you were to just not ever having known about any labeling of the heart and just cut it open, and I asked you to describe what you saw, you might very well say, oh, I see that there's this one really big cavity and 3 smaller cavities. So, and so of course we, from the time that we're young, I imagine most of us have been taught in school that there's the 4 cavities of the right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle, and we just kind of think of them more, even though we know this one might be bigger, this one might be smaller, but you wouldn't really think of them as 1 as 4. You would think about them, whatever, as 2 ventricles and 2 atriums. It's interesting to see how the Gemara is talking about it. Just kind of a different perspective. So by Reb Zera asks, Lebeis chalol ka'in or lebeis chalol gadol. So when the Mishnah talks about the heart being punctured into one of its, what did I call it, cavities, so is that specifically the large cavity? Is that specifically the left ventricle? Or can it even be any of the smaller cavities, any of the atriums and the right ventricle as well? Abai says, Maiti bailach. Abai says to Reb Zera, what's the question? Now this could be a younger Reb Zera. I think that there were multiple Reb Zeras. There was the one Reb Zera who was a Talmud of Rav Yehuda, who moved to Eretz Yisrael. I don't know that this would be Abai interacting with him. There was a younger Reb Zera. I think it may be that one. Anyways, so Amalei Abai says to Reb Zera, "My tibaylach." Well, I don't understand the question. Of course, it's talking about the left ventricle, the big one. Milotanan. After all, do we not learn in our Mishnah on Daf Mem Beis? Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, "Acha tinakev lebeis asimponis." That when it comes to the lung, so the Mishnah had said if there's a puncture in the lung, so then it's a treifa. Reb Shimon had to say that puncture. So Reb Shimon says that puncture needs to be in the bronchi. V'amar Rabba bar Tachlifa, Amar Reb Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rab, Achatinakev l'simpon gadol. The big bronchi. So let's take a look at the bronchi of the lung. So here's the bronchi of the lung. So you can see, of course, the trachea. The trachea coming, the big tube coming from the top. That's the trachea. Now, once it gets to the lungs, it splits in two, right? As you can see, there are two main bronchi, one that goes into the right lobe, the right side, and one that goes into the left side. So who is this? Rav bar Tachlifa, Amar Reb Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rab. So they said that when Reb Shimon is talking about a puncture in one of the bronchi, he's talking about one of the main bronchi. He said there's all those little bronchi, but they bronchi into these two main bronchi. One main bronchi, bronchiole, I don't know, on either side, right? Of course, the lungs have two sides to them. So you got one main one on the right side and one main one on the left side. So we're talking specifically about a puncture in one of the main ones. And therefore, says Abaye, just like by the lungs, we're talking about a puncture in one of the main bronchi. So also by the heart, we're going to be talking about the left ventricle, the big cavity. To which the Gemara says, not so fast. Awesome. When it comes to the lungs, what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, lebeis simponos. Right? Lebeis simponos katani. Simponos is plural. And because simponos is plural, leicha de shapre simponos kulu, it's the place, so the puncture needs to be the base simponos, where multiple bronchi converge into the main bronchi. So because it says the base simponos, we're talking about where the puncture has to be in one of the main bronchi, where all of the smaller bronchi, the smaller branches, converge into the main bronchi. And we're talking about the main one. But over in our Mishnah, when we're talking about the heart, it says lebeis chalalo, which is singular, and therefore mali chalal gadol, mali chalal katan. It could be any one of the cavities, whether it's the big cavity, whether it's any of the smaller cavities. The Gemara argues that the puncture could be into any of the four cavities. Great. Kane halev. When it comes to the kane halev, the question is, what is the kane halev? I don't have a slide with the heart. Why don't I have a slide? I don't know. I didn't want to get stuck on talking too much about the heart because it's complicated, and I just assume that we have a general idea about the heart. Like if I just say stuff about the heart, I feel like that should be enough. So kane halev, when it comes to the pipe of the heart, the question is, what is the pipe of the heart? We're going to get there in a second. But regarding this kane halev, Rav Omer b'mashu, Rav says that if there's even the smallest hole, it is a treifa. Ushmuel Omer birubo, and Shmuel says no, it would have to be sliced through most of it. I'm going to chop a shluck of water. We'll go weiter in just a second. So now, after Rav says we're talking about any, right, even the slightest puncture, and Shmuel says it has to be a majority. So the Gemara asks, "Hey, new kane halev, what is this kane halev?" Amar Rabba bar Yitzchak Amar Rab, chaylev sha'al gabe difanos. Interesting. The fat that is on the I don't know, flanks on the. Basically, it says Rabbi Yitzchak Amarab that the this puncture that we're talking about in the Kana Alev refers to the fat that covers the ribs, that goes down from the vertebrae, from the spine, and covers the ribs. That is what we're talking about if it's punctured. I don't understand what is that? What does that have to do with being a treifa, and what does that have to do with the heart? So Ella shal gabe dofne reya. No, rather, what it's talking about is al gabe dofne reya. It is the pipe that is on the walls of the heart, I guess. Okay, basically, so let's take a look at this diagram over here. This is Batsum a goat. Well, Google Slides has this new feature where they, like, I don't know, always ask you to beautify the slide for you. But, yeah, you have to keep on Xing out of it. Anyways, so where are we? So this is a goat, be'etzem, like the inner insides of a goat, kind of. So I have some arrows here. So the arrows that I am pointing, so basically the golden arrow, which is the left, on the one that's golden. So the golden arrow is pointing to the lungs. Now the red arrow beneath that is pointing to the heart. It's a little bit hard to see, but the heart kind of fits underneath the lungs. The blue arrow on the top is pointing to the spleen, but that's really only pointing to the spleen because we're looking at the left side of the animal. Really what I want to be pointing to is the liver, which is what it would be pointed, which is kind of there, but on the other side of the animal. Why am I saying this? Because what the Kana Alev is, it's the aorta. The aorta is the main. I always forget this word. There's the veins and there's the arteries. It's an obvious word, but I keep forgetting that word. Anyways, so the aorta is like the main. I think it's the biggest artery in the body. It's the main artery that when the left ventricle pumps that blood out of the heart, so then some of it goes to the upper body, but then it is pumped also for the rest of the body, to the back of the body. So what happens is, so you see that the red arrow is pointing to the heart, that's kind of tucked away underneath the lungs. So what happens is the aorta, which is at the top of the heart, is then going to loop back underneath the lungs. Now there are two lungs, right? There's the left side of the lungs and the right side of the lungs. So in between the two lungs, the aorta is then folding back, and it's wrapped in this like fatty kind of stuff. And from there, it'll go through the diaphragm, which we're going to see a little bit later. And it'll go through the diaphragm, and from there to the liver, which is basically where that blue arrow is pointed to. It's pointed to the spleen again, because we're looking at the left side, but essentially the aorta is going to, the artery is going to end up in going to the liver. Now, that is all to say that is the Kana Halev that we're talking about. Again, Elishal Gabe Dofne Are, it's the artery that is on the walls of the heart that basically comes from the heart, wraps around underneath. That's on the walls of the lungs. It comes from the heart, wraps underneath the lungs, and then travels in between the lungs through the diaphragm to get to the liver. Okay. Hopefully I got that mostly right. Okay, so it is the aorta. So that is what they are talking about, the aorta. And so there's a machlekes there between Rav and Shmuel if it has a hole any size, if it's a treifa, or a dafka would have to be most of the Kana Alev would have to be cut through. Now, Amra Meimer says, Ameimer Mishmei de Rav Nachman, Tlasa Kaneyavu. This is like a little bit tricky to explain. I'm going to explain it one way. There are other ways to explain it. Tlasa Kaneyavu, there are three veins, arteries. Chad Parish Leliba, one to the heart, although I'm really going to explain it as from the heart. V'chad Parish L'reya, one to the lungs. V'chad Parish L'kavda, and one to, although technically I'm going to explain it as really from the liver. So basically, it's talking about, the way I'm explaining it, there are other ways to explain it. The way I'm explaining it is that it's talking essentially about the heart. The heart, there's a lot going on in the heart. Again, I didn't have a photo of the heart because the heart is a complicated organ. and I didn't want to complicate things. But basically, there's a lot. I didn't want to start explaining. There's a lot of things coming in and out of the heart, going to the lungs, coming from the lower body, from the upper body, pumping to the lower body. There's a lot going on with the heart. So I didn't want to distract us. But I figured, what did I figure? I don't know what I figured. I guess I think I probably figured I would just talk about a few things. So there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. Blood coming into the heart, coming out of the heart, from the lower body, from the upper body, to the lungs, from the lungs. Now we're going to focus right now on the aorta. That's what it's referring to the heart. So I'm really explaining it from the heart. So let's read it again. So there are three. I'm explaining it as veins/arteries. Chad parish leliba, one to the heart. Although I'm really explaining it as from the heart, and that's a reference to the aorta. You have the aorta. That is the massive artery that the left ventricle is pumping blood out of. V'chad parish l'reya, and you also have the pulmonary. I think this would be the pulmonary vein, which would be going to the lungs. Basically, you have blood coming into the heart from the rest of the body, from the lower body, from the upper body. It all comes into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it, I believe, goes into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, I believe it goes via the pulmonary vein to the lungs to get oxygenated, because the blood that's coming into the heart needs to be oxygenated. So it's then sent via the pulmonary vein, I think, to the lungs. Neil and Sharna, how am I doing over here with biology? And then from the lungs, it gets oxygenated with these bronchi that we saw. So that is, I would imagine that is the v'chad parish l'reya, that we were talking about, the vein/arteries and the lung. I imagine we're talking about the pulmonary vein that's taking the deoxygenated blood to the lung to the lungs to get oxygenated, and then I think it would probably go by the pulmonary artery back to the heart, and there it would go into the left atrium. Anyways, fine. And then v'chad parish l'chavda, and one to the liver, but I'm really going to understand that from the liver. That basically the liver, there's like a main from the liver. As I mentioned, there's blood coming to the heart from the whole body, from the upper body, from the lower body. The blood that comes to the heart from the lower body is coming from a vein, in a big vein in the liver, and that sends blood to the heart. So I think we're talking about that vein. Anyways, fine. Now, direya kireya, the pulmonary vein, which goes to the lung, has the same din as the lungs, just like we said in the Mishnah that if the lungs get punctured any amount, and we're going to learn about it later. So also the pulmonary vein, any amount. If there's a puncture, any amount. The kavda kikavda, and the vein coming from the liver is like the liver in that if it's missing, so then it's a problem. The liba, and in terms of the aorta, pligi, that was the machlekes Rav and Shmuel, whether it's like Rav that it's a tiny little hole is going to be a treifa, or it's like Shmuel that it has to be cut rove of the way. Mar bar chia masne ipcha. Mar bar chia taught the opposite in terms of the pulmonary vein and the liver vein. Direya ki kavda, that the pulmonary vein is like the liver, that it's a treifa if it's missing. The kavda kireya, and the vein from the liver is like the lungs in that if there is any puncture at all, it is a treifa. Deliba plige, and when it comes to the aorta, that is the machlekes between Rav and Shmuel. Also, Rav Chia bar Yosef Amar l'shmata derav kami d'Shmuel. Rav Chia bar Yosef went and said over Rav's teaching about the mashu to Shmuel, as Rashi points out. Rav was in Surah, Shmuel was in Rav was in Surah, Shmuel was in Naradoya. So messages, right? So Shmuel would not know about what Rav taught until he somehow found out about it. So he just found out about it. Omalei, and he says to Rav Chia bar Yosef, Yochi Omer Abba, if this is what Rav said, Lo Yoda Treif is Lo Klum. Interesting. Shmuel, I think that's a very, I think uncharacteristic, I think, way that Shmuel would relate to Rab. But he says, if this is what Rab says, he doesn't know a thing about Treifus. Right? He says, Lo yada b'Treifus lo klum. He doesn't know anything about Treifus. Very interesting. I mean, it's also interesting because he called Rab Abba, right? He called Rab Abba out of respect, while also saying that if this is what he says, then he doesn't know the first thing about Treifus. Very, 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 very interesting. Now we discuss the spinal cord. Nishbar Ashedra, if the spinal cord is broken. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis thought, Chut Ashedra, if the spinal cord, Shenifsat Berubo, Divrei Rebbe, that the animal's a treifa if the spinal cord is mostly broken. That's the opinion of Rebbe. Reb Yaakov says, Reb Yaakov, afilu nikev, even if it just got punctured. So Rebbe says that the animal's a treifa only if the spinal cord is mostly broken, whereas Reb Yaakov says even just the smallest puncture would make it a treifa. We're going to get more into detail in just a moment. Hora Rebbe Reb Yaakov, Rebbe, even though he says that it's only a treifa if most of the spinal cord is broken, nonetheless, when a situation came before him, he paskined like Reb Yaakov nonetheless, that even if it was just the smallest hole, he said that the animal was a treifa. Rav Huna ein halacha Reb Yaakov, but nonetheless says Rav Huna that the halacha is not like Reb Yaakov, rather it's like Rebbe, that the animal would be a treifa if the spinal cord was broken most of the way. Kama rubo, and what's considered a rov? Rav Amar rov oro. So Rav says a majority of the skin. The Amrila rov mocho. Some say a majority of the actual cord of the nerve tissue. Manda Amar. We're going to explain all this stuff in a second. Manda Amar rov mocho. The one who says the majority of the nerve tissue, Kolshken rov oro, certainly the majority of the skin. Manda Omer rov. I'm reading too much. We're gonna so let's actually just quickly look at a photo here, and then we can do this again. I think we just need to look at a photo first. So here, so this is the spinal cord. I mean, the spinal cord, of course, probably. What are we even looking at? I didn't actually think what we're looking at. I imagine that where it's coming from is probably the brain. I imagine that that's coming from the brain. Unless it's just coming from a vertebrae. I don't know. Maybe it's coming from a vertebrae. I don't know. But basically, of course, the spinal cord goes from the brain and through the vertebrae. The vertebrae kind of creates almost like a cylinder around it, like a protection around it. And it goes through the vertebrae all the way down through the tail. Now, we're going to learn later on about where it ends. But anyways, so the spinal cord, it kind of goes through all the vertebrae, and in there's like nerve tissue. So if we look at this photo, so we can see, if you look at the label on the right, it says moach pnimi, it's essentially the nerve tissue is inside, and it's around, the other label says or, by a type of skin. Okay, so basically that's the spinal cord. So there's an outer skin that's filled with this nerve tissue. Okay, so we're saying that so we saw Machlekes Rebbe and Reb Yaakov about for the animal to be a treifa, whether it has to be broken, most of the spinal cord needs to be broken most of the way, or just a small hole. Rav Huna said that we hold like Rebbe that says a majority of the way. And now we're discussing, are we talking about a majority of the skin, i.e. the skin has to be cut, a majority of the circumference of the skin needs to be cut, or are we saying a majority of the nerve tissue needs to be cut through? That is our question. So where should we start from? Let's start from V'chama Rubo, okay? It's about 2 lines after the 2 dots. So V'chama Rubo, what's considered a rov? Rav Omar rov oro. So Rav says a majority of the skin, that if a majority of the circumference of the skin has been cut, so that is a treifa. V'amila rov mocho, but some say that it means a majority of the nerve tissue needs to be cut through. Manda rov mocho, according to the opinion who says a majority of the nerve tissue, kol sheken rov oro, certainly if a certainly if a majority of the skin was cut through, it would be a treifa because the nerve tissue would just kind of leak through the skin, right? So if you're going to say that it's if you're going to say it's a majority of the nerve tissue, it's in addition to the skin, because let me not say that. But essentially, if you say that a majority of the nerve tissue needs to be broken, certainly if a majority of the skin was broken, it would be a treifa because the nerve tissue would then like ooze out through it. Lamanda Amar Oro, but where am I? Did I skip? Okay, fine. Yeah, okay, right. Lamanda Amar Oro, Rov Oro. Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. I skipped. Yeah, okay. Lamanda Amar Rov Oro, but according to the opinion that it's a majority of the skin, Rov Mocho Mai. What about the nerve tissue? What about that? Does it need to be a majority of the way as well? Tashma Kamanir, Damar Nivli Amar Ravuna, Rubo Sha'amru Rov Oro. That when they talk about a rov by the spinal cord, it's a rov of the skin. Moach ze lomalav lomorid. And in terms of the nerve tissue, doesn't make a difference. That's not important. Rav Nosson bar Ovin Ava Yosef Kame the Rav Nosson bar Ovin was sitting before Rav Bodak Birov Oro, and he checked the spinal cord with the majority of the skin, the Kabadik Birov Mocho, and then he proceeded to check a majority of the nerve tissue. Amarle, and Rav says to him, in Rov Oro Kayim, look, once already you can confirm that a majority of the skin is intact. Moach ze enomale ve'enomorid. So the nerve tissue isn't going to make a difference. Okay, so we had seen two different opinions on what Rab was saying. One is that we're talking about a majority of the nerve tissue, and certainly if you have a majority of the skin that's split, either one would be a treifa. And there was a different opinion that no, it's specifically the skin if it's cut a majority of the way to the circumference, but the nerve tissue itself makes no difference either way. If the nerve tissue becomes completely, just entirely becomes liquid, nismasmes. So we said, so if it becomes liquid, it's a treifa. Nismasmes, if it gets soft, not quite liquidy, but soft, also it is, where am I? Also, it is a treifa. Ezu hamrocha, what is hamrocha? What is nismarech? Bezu hamasmasa. Hamrocha kol shenishbach kikiton. That hamrocha is if the nerve tissue liquefies and it's like you could swish it around in the nerve, in the spinal cord, like you'd swish around water in a jug. Masmisa kol she'enu yachol lamod. If basically you take the spinal cord and you attempt to hold it up straight, but it just flops over. So even though the nerve tissue isn't exactly liquid, but it's soft enough that if you try to just hold the spinal cord vertically in your hand, it'll flop over. That would be masmisa. But Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, "Eno yachol la'amod mipnei kovdo mai." What if it flops over, but not because it's soft, but because it's too heavy? It's solid, but it's very heavy, and it flops over because it's too heavy. Mai teku, it's a tie. Bei Rav Amri, they say by the Bismillah of Rav, this masmes pasul, that if it flops over, if it's too soft, it's pasul. This mazmes kosher. But if it depletes, if the nerve tissue kind of gets depleted, that there becomes less of it, kosher, it is nonetheless kosher. However, we have a contradiction. From Shimon Elazar, it says from Shimon Elazar, behema shenismazmes mocha treifa, that an animal that its nerve tissue depleted, it is a treifa. So we had just said it's kosher, but here we see it's a treifa. No, that wasn't depleted. That was softened. Anyway, is that really so? Levi Abayosad Be Masusa. Levi was in the bathhouse. Chazilahu Gavin, he saw a certain fellow that he bumped his head, he knocked his head pretty hard. Omar, and Levi says, Nismazmez moche dedain. He says, Oy, Chaval, this guy depleted his brain. Lav dilochai, does it not mean that because he depleted his brain, he's not going to live? Amabai lo mashena molid, no, it means that he's not going to be able to have any more children. Okay. Anyways, so we wanted to say that we wanted to try to bring this as a proof that if the nerve tissue gets depleted, so then the animal should be a treifa, that it won't be able to live. But we said no, that particular incident had to do more with being able to have children rather than being able to actually live. Now the Gemara asked, Ad heichon chut hashedra? Until where does the chut hashedra go? Meaning the chut hashedra, the spinal cord, it goes from the brain all the way through the tail. So what do you mean, where does it go until? It goes until the end of the tail. Correct. But at a certain point, if it breaks, it's no longer a treifa, right? So if, by the brain and throughout the back, the spinal cord gets severed, so yeah, it'll be a treifa. But at a certain point, that no longer continues to be the case. At what point does that cease being the case? At what point on the spinal cord, if at that point and on it gets broken, nish gefährlich? Where does the chut hashedra go until? Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel ad bein ha-parashos, until the bein ha-parashos. Okay, let us talk about the bein ha-parashos for a second. Okay, let's take a look at this slide over here. So what are we looking at? What we're looking at is basically, we're looking at the spinal cord. At the top of the photo, it's basically coming into the photo from the top, basically from the brain and all the vertebrae and all that stuff. We're getting towards the tail right now. And at the bottom of the photo, we're like mamish getting into the tail. So once we start getting closer to the tail, what ends up happening is, throughout the spine, from the brain throughout the spine, there are these nerves that the spinal cord is branching out, and there are nerves going down to the right and to the left to the body, right? The nerves are kind of spreading out throughout the body. So that's happening throughout the spinal column. However, the spinal cord, however, as that happens throughout the spinal cord, the thickness of the spinal cord remains the same. So you have the spinal cord comes from the brain and it goes throughout the vertebrae, throughout the spine, and it's branching off to the right, branching off to the left, but the thickness of the spinal cord remains the same, remains consistent throughout. However, once the spinal cord starts getting towards the tail, what ends up happening is that as the spinal cord branches out to the right and to the left, it actually starts getting thinner. Okay, so at a certain point, you have a branch going to the right and a branch going to the left, and then what's left is actually thinner than what was before. And then you have another branch going to the right and to the left, and again, what remains is thinner than it was before that. And it starts branching out until basically until it ends. So what the Gemara is saying is that when we say that that if the spinal cord breaks and is severed, the animal is a treifa. So if it breaks and severed, the animal is a treifa. So that is until this point. As long as the spinal cord is branching to the right and to the left, but it's keeping its same thickness, it's still the spinal cord that if it breaks, it'll be a treifa. Once it starts getting thinner, so then at that point, if it gets severed, it will no longer render the animal to be a treifa. So, okay, maybe that is enough for now. So it's just bigadol and a high. Don't worry about the arrows maybe for now. What we see in this photo, though, is that as you get towards the spine, you can see that at least if as you get towards the tail, at least like where the red arrow is pointing to, if you notice, as the spinal cord continues, it's getting thinner and thinner and thinner as it branches. That's enough for now, but we are going to come back to this image in just a few moments. Okay. Again, Arechan Chut HaShedra, where does the Chut HaShedra continue until such that if it gets severed, it would be a Treifa? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel ad Bein HaParashos until this is what's called the Bein HaParashos. Let's actually pull up this slide again. So basically, if you look, there are 3 white arrows on the left. The white arrows let's actually look at the red arrow for a second. The red arrow is pointing to basically the first branch that I identified, that after that branch the spinal cord starts getting thinner. So that's what's called the Pi HaParashot, the mouth of the branching off, the opening, the entrance of the branching off. That's where that's where this section begins. That's where I identified it as being at the red arrow. Now the 3 right arrows are what refers to the Bein HaParashot. Basically the parashot are the branches, right? So you could see on the spinal cord, it's branching off, branching off, branching off. And the Bein HaParashot would be the sections in between the branches. Okay? So that's what we're referring to, the Bein HaParashot. So the animal would be a treifa if the spinal cord is severed anywhere until you get to the place the section that we're referring to as the Bein HaParashot, which is specifically between these branches when the spine starts getting thinner. Okay, fine. When the spinal cord starts getting thinner. So again, Arechan Chut HaShedra, where does the Chut HaShedra continue until? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel ad Bein HaParashot, until this area of the spinal cord. Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak avakot boy lemezel levei Chozai. Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak wanted to go to Bei Chozai, also the Kamid of Yehuda, but before he went on his journey, on his trip, he came to Rav Yehuda. Amalei, he says to Rav Yehuda, Lechve limar Bein HaParashos heicha. Can you show me where on the spinal cord the Bein HaParashos begins? Identify me the Pi HaParashot. Identify me where where this section begins, such that at that point any sever would no longer be a treifa. Amar leizil aisi ligdi v'ach veloch. So Rav Yehuda says to Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak, no problem, get me a kid, get me a goat, and I will gladly identify this for you. Aisi ligdi shmeina. So he found a goat that was already cut up and cleaned up and everything. And not like cut up into pieces, but all the nasty stuff was kind of taken out. The stomach, it was kind of cleared out for them to be able to study. But it was very fatty. So Amar le blia tfei v'leyadia. So Rav Yehuda says, this is not going to be an easy one to identify because it's so fatty. So the Pi HaParashot is kind of, it's going to be difficult to identify it in this one. It'll be hard to do quickly. So I see lei kochush. So Rav Dimi bar Yitzchak went back and got another goat, but this one was like particularly scrawny, such that it was like very bony, and the bones were kind of mushing together the meat and squeezing the spinal cord, and also making it difficult to identify the Pi HaParashos there as well. Amar le bliton tvei v'lo yadia, and Rav Yehuda says the bones are sticking out too much and making it too difficult. Amalei ta agmar gemara. And Rav Yehuda says, Benish geferlach. I'll tell you the following. Hachi Amar Shmuel. This is what Shmuel said. Ad achas. So now, if we take out the diagram again, so ad achas, if you look at those arrows, right? The arrows are the Bein HaParashot, the sections between the branches. So until that first Bein HaParashos, treifa. It's a treifa until the first one, right? So coming down the spinal cord from the brain up until that first one, it is treifa. Shlishis, now in terms of the third Bein HaParashos, well, that's already far enough down that it would be considered kosher. Any sever there would no longer be an issue. Shnia, in terms of the second Bein HaParashos, Ein Yodea, I don't know. By Rav Huna bar Yeshua, now we ask a few questions. Rav Huna bar Yeshua asks, Ad ba'ad b'chal, o dilma ad v'lo ad b'chal. When Rav Yehuda says that until the first Bein HaParashos, a sever would be a treifa, is that including the first Beina Parashos, such that if the first Beina Parashos, as it gets severed, it would also be a Treifa up to and including, or excluding it, such that just like the second Beina Parashos, we don't know, so where we don't know what the halacha is, so we would say also we don't know what the halacha is about the first Pia Parashos as well. But Papa says, Intim Salomer ad velo ad b'chlal, and if you want to say ad velo ad b'chlal, i.e., if there's a sever in the first Pia Parashos, we won't know if it's a treifa or not. Pi Parasha Mao, what about, as the red arrow points to, what about the beginning of this section, right before the Beina Parashos, but that initial branch? What if there's a sever there? But Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, Imtim Tzalomer ad ve'ad bichlal, and if you want to say that the first section would be a treifa, Parasha atzmamo, what about the branch itself? The gold arrow in the diagram is pointing to like one of the actual branches. What if one of the actual branches gets severed? So Tashma coming here, a parasha, the branch, tidon kibasa, should be treated like meat, like flesh, i.e., there would be no problem about severing. My lab, parasha rishonos. So let's say it's talking about the first branch, that even if the first branch gets severed, it should be okay. Vishnia, or the second one, lo shlishis. No, I'll say it's talking specifically about the third branch, but we wouldn't know about the first or the second branch. Okay, so we had a whole bunch of technical questions, ad vad b'chlal kind of questions that were kind of unresolved. Be'ofa. Now, what about when it comes to a bird? Okay, all of this so far has been by animals. What about a bird? Birds have a different spinal structure. Rabbi Yana says, Rabbi Yana, limata mina agapayim, Rish Lakish Omer ad bein agapayim. Let's take a look at a diagram of a bird. So there are a few labels on this bird. So you have the chut ashedra. The top label is the chut ashedra. That's the chut ashedra coming from the brain. And then the second label, the bottom left label, is makom chibur akanaf laguf. That is where the wing is connected to the body, and that is what Rish Lakish was talking about, right? Ad ben agapayim, until essentially the wings. And the furthest label to the right is siyum makom shchivas etzem ashechem. That is basically where the wing rests. And that would be what Rabbi Yana says, lemata min agapayim, below the wings. So, okay, so it's a machlokas about where, so if the spinal cord gets severed on a bird or on a chicken, so then it's a machlokas about if it's until the wings start or essentially until the wing bone ends. Amar Ula says, Ula avokaim nekame de ben pazi. I was before ben pazi. Va'aisu lekame, they brought before him ofa, a bird. Uvadak, and he checked ad ben agapayim until the wings began. V'shalach le dvenisia, but then at that moment they sent for him from the Bei Nisia, from the Nasi. V'kam v'azal, and he immediately got up and he went to see if they asked him to come, he immediately got up and went. V'lo yadaina, but I don't know, says Ula, imishum de la tzarich. I don't know if that's because the halacha is like Rish Lakish, unlike Rabbi Yana, that he doesn't need to check any more of the spinal cord. Imishum kvod nesia, or is it because no, he does need to check more, just that out of the honor of the Beit Nesia, of the Nasi, he did not want to delay and he immediately got up and went. So seems that this is also unresolved. Friends, and now we discuss the liver. Nitla akaved v'chule, if the liver was removed. So now, our Mishnah had said if the liver was entirely removed, it is a treifa. This is something that we saw, I believe, on Daf Mem Gimel. So if the liver is entirely removed, it is a treifa. But if any amount of it remains, it is kosher. Now the Mishnah on Daf Nun Daled says that the animal is kosher if the liver is gone, but a kazayas remains, i.e. there has to be a full kazayas. From our Mishnah, it would seem that any amount that remains is kosher. From the Mishnah and Daf Nun Daled, it means that no, not any amount. There would have to be a kazayas. So now, says the Gemara, Nishtayr emena klum kshera. So as long as any amount, according to our Mishnah, remains, the animal is kshera. Even though it is not a kazayis, but it's not. But we learn in a Mishnah Daf Nun Daled, nita lakov nishtayr emena kazayis kshera, that if the liver is gone, but a kazayis remains, it's kshera. But less than a kazayis is treifa. Reb Yosef lo kasha, says Reb Yosef nish geferlich, ha Reb Chia ha Reb Shimon bar Rebbe. It's machlekes between Reb Chia and Reb Shimon bar Rebbe. Ki ha Reb Chia zarik la, Reb Shimon bar Rebbe matbil la. Because Reb Chia would discard the liver. According to him, the liver was not something that you ate. Reb Shimon bar Rebbe, on the other hand, davke ate the liver. Why did Reb Shimon bar Rebbe eat the liver? Because he understood that the liver was actually played a really important role in the animal. It was like a critical part of that for the health of the animal. And therefore the understanding was that if it's so healthy for the animal, it must also be healthy to eat, which is why Reb Shimon bar Rebbe would not discard the liver, he would eat the liver. So according to Reb Shimon bar Rebbe, the liver plays a vital role in the animal, and therefore there would have to be a kazayas such that if the liver is gone, but there is a kazayas left, so then it can regenerate. So there would have to be a kazayas left. That would be Reb Shimon bar Rebbe's shita. According to Reb Chia, he says he would discard the liver because, according to him, it didn't really play a very important role in the animal, and therefore, as long as any amount remains, it's okay, and it wouldn't have to be a kazayas to be able to regenerate or anything. Any amount would be okay, according to Reb Chia. Ve'simanich ashirin mikamtzin. And if you want to remember who's the one who threw out the liver and who kept it, the Reb Shimon bar Rebbe, who was the son of Reb Yehuda Nasi, who came from a wealthy family, he dafka wouldn't throw away the liver, right? Even though he was wealthy, he was also stingy, so to speak, i.e., that's just a way to remember it, that the wealthy one is actually the one who did not throw it away. Ha'u pulmusa da'asa pumbedisa, there was the soldiers of the king came to Pumbedisa, and guess who had to fly the coop? Arku, Rabba of Rav Yosef. Rabba and Rav Yosef fled the town. They felt a little bit uncomfortable with the pulmusa being around. Pagabu, Reb Zera, and Reb Zera bumped into them. Omar Lu, and he says to them, Arukai, refugees, fugitives, Kazayis, Sha'amu, B'makom Mara. Reb Zera says to them that the Kazayis that they're talking about, right, when we talk about a Kazayis being left from the liver, it's specifically where the gallbladder is connected to the liver. Rav Adabar Ahava Omar b'makom shi chaya, the place where it lives. Okay. Omar Papa says, Papa ilkal. Therefore, we need both. Kazayis b'makom mara uvin kazayis b'makom shi chaya. We need both the kazayis by the gallbladder and where it lives, so to speak. I don't really know exactly how to define where it lives, but essentially, let's have a look at this diagram over here. So, okay, this is a goat hanging upside down, and its belly's been open. Now, what do I want to show you? So, on the right side, you see that there are 4 labels on the right side. The second label from the bottom is kaved. That's the liver. Basically, what you're looking at in this photo is a goat that's been sliced open, and on the right side of the cavity, there's all that livery looking stuff. That's the liver. Now that radioactive looking thing with the label that says Kis Hamara, the bottom label, that's the gallbladder. Okay. Now, okay. So first of all, so we saw who had said this. Who had said that about the gallbladder? Right. So Reb Zera had said that when we're talking about a kazayis remaining of the liver, it needs to be that kazayis, the kazayis where the gallbladder is attached to the liver. But now, Rav Papa, who was it? Rav Papa, Rav Adabar Hava So there has to be the place where it lives. Okay, I'm not exactly sure how to define that, but anyways, the liver is attached to the diaphragm. If you look at the labels on the left side, so the bottom label says tarpasha. That is it's pointing to the diaphragm. It's pointing to something white. Basically, if you look to, so it's pointing to something white. Also to the left of the whiteness, there's like what looks like meat, what looks like muscle. That's all part of the diaphragm. I think we've seen a photo of the diaphragm before. Maybe I should have made a slide. Nah, I don't think it's needed. But basically, that's the diaphragm. It's basically the liver is attached to the diaphragm. Okay. It's also, if you look at the labels on the right side, the label all the way at the top says klayot, kidneys. It's pointing to the two kidneys. The liver is also attached to the kidneys. Okay, so there's two possibilities for what this chaya thing is. It's either where the liver is attached to the diaphragm, or it's where the kidney and the right kidney and the liver are connected to one another. So we basically have three places where there would need to be a kazayas of liver. Where the gallbladder is connected to the liver, there would have to be a kazayas. Where the liver is connected to the diaphragm, there would have to be a kazayas. And where the liver and the right kidney are adjoined to one another, are connected to one another, there would have to be a kazayas of liver there as well. Right? Again, Amar Papa says, therefore, ba'inan kazayas b'makom, we need a kazayas where the gallbladder is connected to the liver, but also va'inan kazayas b'makom shi chaya, we need a place where it lives, where it's connected. Now, that could either be where it's connected to the diaphragm or where it's connected to the right kidney. By Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, Mislakit ma, what if there's a kazayas, but it's not like one full kazayas, it's like a little bit of a kazayas here, a little bit of kazayas there. Kiritsuah ma, what if it's not like a round kazayas, but it's like a strip of a kazayas, but it has the volume of a kazayas. By Rab Ashi kazayas mirudad ma, what if it's a kazayas, but it's like you took like a hammer of sorts, and you pounded it, some kind of pounding device. Teku, it's a tie. But mine Reb Zrika me Reb Ami nidaldala kaved umeura betar pashe mao. What if the liver is kind of dangling? It's still connected to the diaphragm, but it's kind of dangling a bit. So Amar Lei, so Rabbi Ami responds, Dildul ze eini yodea mau. I don't know what's the problem. I don't see what the issue is. If the main concern is that the gallbladder should be connected to the liver, it is. And if the concern is that it should be connected to the diaphragm, it still is connected to the diaphragm. And now we begin talking about the lungs, and we're not going to get that far into it, and we're going to continue discussing the lungs tomorrow. Hareya shenikva, if a lung got punctured, so it is a treifa. Rav Shmuel, Rav Asi, de Amre, Rav Shmuel and Rav Asi say, karma ilah v'amila karma tata. There is. So on the lungs, I don't have a photo of this. I thought I could just talk. There's not that much to see. Basically, the lungs are encompassed in basically two layers of membrane. Two membranes. There are two membranes that cover the lungs. That's it. So that if the upper membrane is punctured, it's a treifa. And some say if the lower membrane is punctured. Amar Rav Yosef bar Manyomi, Amar Rav Nachman v'simonich kituna divarda, that it's like a pink tunic, demancha berea, that the lungs are wrapped in. Pshuta inkiv ila'a v'lo inkiv tata megan. So says the Gemara. So first of all, we just had two options, right? The first option was that if the top membrane is punctured, it is a treifa. The other option was that if the bottom membrane is punctured, it is a treifa. So we are assuming right now like that view, that it's the top one doesn't matter. If just the top membrane is punctured, it's kosher. But if the bottom membrane is punctured, it is treif. Now, pshita I inkuv ila'a v'lo inkuv tata megan. So certainly if the upper membrane is punctured, but the lower membrane is intact, it is kosher because the lower membrane will protect the lungs. Kidirava, like Rava Damarava, hai reya de iglid, that if you have a lung that the outer membrane has been removed, ki ahina sumka, like a red date, kshera, nonetheless the lungs are kshera because the lower membrane will protect the lungs. Inkiv tata v'lo inkiv ila megan lo megan. But what now? Certainly, of course, if the upper membrane and the lower membrane are punctured, it would be a treifa. But what if the lower membrane was punctured, but the upper membrane was not? Again, inkiv tata, if the lower membrane was punctured, v'lo inkiv ila, but the upper membrane was intact. Megan or lo megan, would that protect the lungs or not? Pligiba, one opinion is lo megan, it doesn't protect the lungs. V'chad omar megan, the other opinion is that the lungs will be protected in such a case. The halacha is megan, that if the lower membrane is found to be punctured, but the upper membrane is intact, the animal will be kosher. The upper membrane will protect the lungs. Rav Yosef, like Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef, hi reya, if you have a lung, de avsha, that if after the animal is shechted, and you like breathe into, you blow into the lung, and you hear like a whistling coming out, and you're not sure if maybe there's a puncture in the lung, and that's what the whistle is. So so if we can identify where the air is escaping, so mosvina ala gadfa, so you could take a feather, o roka, o gila. Let's explain gila first. So you could take either a feather or a piece of straw, and you can put it by where you've identified the whistling, and see if it's like the feather is blowing at all. If it's blowing, then that means that there's a hole and the air is coming out of it. O roka, or spit, you can like put some spit over the hole and see if it bubbles. Imivatspitza treifa. So if the spit bubbles, or if the feather or the straw kind of move around, so then it's a treifa because there's air escaping. The ilo ksher, but if you know where the whistling is coming from and nothing's moving, right? The feather is not moving or blowing or anything, so then it's ksher. It's some kind of an internal thing, but it's kosher. The lo yadinan eicha absha, but if we don't know where the whistling is coming from, maisinan masichlisa de maya. So we take a bucket of water, pashure, lukewarm, right, room temperature water, mosvinan la bigava, and we put the lungs in the lukewarm water. Bichamime lo, we don't put it in hot water, de kavtse, because then the lungs will shrivel up onto the hole and block the hole. Bikariri lo, but also not in water that is cold, de mitarshe, because it'll stiffen up the lungs and then it can actually create a hole where there was none before. Ela mosvinan bepshure, we put it in lukewarm water and room temperature water. Vinafchina lo, and then once the lungs are submerged in the water, we blow into the lungs. I mivatzbitza treifa, if the water bubbles, that means that air is escaping and it's a treifa, there's a hole in the lungs. The lo, if it doesn't bubble, kshera, the lungs are kosher. What's the whistling that we're hearing? Tata inkiv, it means that the lower membrane is pierced, ila lo inkiv, but the upper one is intact and no air is escaping. And what we're hearing is bahai da avsha zika de bene benehu. The whistling that we're hearing is the air kind of like having some awkward escape through the hole in the lower membrane, but being trapped and unable to escape the upper membrane, and it's creating some kind of whistle sound. But no air is escaping, and therefore it is kosher. Friends, we are going to hold it here for Daf Mem Vav of Masechta Chullin. On Daf Mem of Masechta Chullin, we continued going through the different treifas listed in our Mishnah. We talked about the heart, when the heart is punctured, right? Where does it have to get punctured into? And different arteries right? The aorta, if it gets cut, is it like Rob says only a little bit, or like Shmuel that it has to be a majority? We discussed the spinal cord also, if it only needs to get punctured a little bit, or does it have to be a majority? We said in the end a majority like Rebbe. We discussed where does the spinal cord go until, right? Where does it end? We talked about the Beina Paroshos, that when the spinal cord starts branching off and getting thinner as it does branch off, that is where that is the point at which that is the point at which if the spinal cord breaks, it will still remain kosher. We discussed what happens by a bird, what happens by a chicken. There's machlokes Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yanai about if the spinal cord ends at the beginning of the wings or at the end of the wings. We discussed the liver and how much of the liver has to remain, whether any amount of liver needs to remain, or right, if it's entirely missing, it's a treifa, but if any amount remains, it is kosher, like Reb Chia says, or it does have to be dafka be a kazayis, like Reb Shimon Berebi. And we discussed where does this kazayis have to be, dafka by the gallbladder, by the diaphragm, by where it's connected to the kidney. And we begin discussing the lungs, that if there is a puncture, the lung is a treifa. We said if the puncture is only on the outer membrane, it is kosher. And if it is only on the lower membrane, it is also kosher. It is treifa when there's a hole puncturing the outer and lower membranes. Friends, that was the Mem Vav of Masechet Chullin. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.